Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Determination, Deliberation, and Dragons, a creative writing podcast where we talk about dragons with both determination and deliberation. I'm Peter,
And I'm Izzy.
and we're gonna talk about the eighth and second to last story in the Pana and Wave Skimmer cycle. So, today we're gonna be talking about rising action and what that means. But first, we are going to talk about the rising action in a different story, a story that some of you may know from a little known book called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Basically, we wanted to talk about this because there's a clear series of rising actions that leads up to the final confrontation with Voldemort. Harry and his friends discover that the Sorcerer's Stone is at risk, it's going to be stolen at a specific night, and they go and try to stop they think Snape is going to steal it. So they go and try to stop Snape from stealing it. And then they find out it's Voldemort and Quirrell. But in order to get to the stone, they first have to go through a series of events. So you'll all remember the three-headed dog that they need to face first, and then the plant, Devil's Snare, that tries to strangle them. And then there's keys. They go through a chess match thing. They thankfully don't have to fight a second troll because Quirrell already took out the troll, and Hermione solves a logic puzzle with potions. But I think the idea here is all these events are kind of getting us to the final confrontation. We know that something crazy is going to happen, and Harry's going to, for us rereading it, we know Harry's going to fight Voldemort. It's going to be this big thing. He's going to learn a lot about himself, his connection to Voldemort, his parents, what it means to be an 11-year-old kid fighting just pure evil. But it doesn't happen right away, and there's things that he needs to do first. And I mean, you can analyze some of the obstacles and maybe come up with things that maybe Harry learned from those obstacles, or ways in which he was tested in order to overcome those obstacles. But I think it's interesting that in order to get to this final place, there's a thing he needs to do. So it feels very sequential, necessary, you need to do this in the right sequence. There's a spatial element to it, he needs to move through this space to get to the Sorcerer's Stone room. So there's a lot to kind of think about with rising action. I don't know if Izzy, if you have any additional thoughts.
Those were many good thoughts. I was thinking of it more of a literal sense of step A, step B, step C before X marks the spot and we get to the big boss battle with Voldemort or whatever your climax is for your story. So I was thinking of it more of a literal going up each step in the rising action as like a stairway from up and up and up to sort of ramp up readers' expectations and get them excited for whatever might be coming next in the story.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, within the context of the series, that's what's happening. He's fighting Voldemort, but he's really fighting Quirrell. And then, Voldemort comes, much later. I also just think it's really funny that they're literally moving down through space, they're going deeper underground. But yeah, certainly I think your point about it being sequential is spot on. So before we get into our conversation about the story itself, I'm going to tell you what happens in the story. So this will be a quick summary. Basically, in the previous story, Pana figures out that yes, they are going to go and help try to disarm, destroy, whatever, the weapons of mass destruction that are still in place. And in this story, they're going to find the weapon. So they're literally just hiking and they try to go and find it. They reach a plateau. So MC is the map maker and she believes that it's on the top of this plateau. She's like, oh, there's no other place a weapon would be. It doesn't make sense for it to be anywhere else based off of the landscape here. And then they find out like no, it is not on the plateau. It is in a giant sinkhole that's like 2 miles wide. So that's where we end off. And we also have like a flashback scene with Vare as the village is preparing to go after Pana. She like visits Pana's father. So it's sad and it was rough to write. That's basically it.
But Vare doesn't actually appear in the chapter. I haven't questioned it, but I do kind of wonder where she went.
Yeah, she doesn't appear in like the current time. So I don't know, where could she be?
Lurking in the shadows.
Yeah, I mean most of the people were dropped off. So aside from like essential sailing personnel, the boat is relatively empty at this point. But that doesn't mean that everyone got off the boat. So just in terms of rising action, I do think it's important to point out that this story wasn't ever intended to be its own separate short story. And in a way, I mean, all the other short stories I really tried to make, not necessarily self-contained stories, but there's like this element of kind of like in Avatar: The Last Airbender, where like there's a beginning, middle, and end to each individual episode. And I really try to kind of stick to that for this. Like I didn't write this in chapters. I wrote it in short stories. And this one just isn't like that, I think. I mean, maybe it could be to a certain extent, but I think like if it was at least in written form, like I would need to definitely add a lot more. I think in my mind this is like a cool like visual TV episode sort of. So my point is that it wasn't intended to be like this rising action like before, its own kind of separate piece that this like distinguishes itself from the previous one in like the final chapter. It's sort of just the final chapter sort of just became like way too long and I wanted to like cut out a chunk of it. So it's when we were talking about rising action with Harry Potter, like it's very clear that there's like this space between and like time between the final action and figuring out that the stone is going to be stolen. And I'm curious to hear more about like how you think this works as a rising action within the context of this story, not knowing of course what happens next.
Yeah. At this point, my expectation, as I have been told in the story, is that now that they have found the weapon, step B is destroy the weapon after they figure out how to actually do that. So, I'm presuming they're going to go about that in some kind of way, and maybe things will go wrong in that process. But that's my expectation for Climax's big explosion, kaboom, of some kind. But I personally think this fits. I mean, obviously, it was meant to come before the climax, anyways. So it's not like sticking a flashback scene in here totally randomly. Although there is a small flashback scene. But I think it works as the part of the rising action because not all of the rising action is, constant, like going up a steep slope, sprinting. But this one is more of a plateau and then we're heading for another sprint.
Literally.
So,
So.
yeah. And they literally scale up a plateau, scale up a cliff to a plateau. So yes, that literally happens in the story. But I also think for the pacing of the story, it makes sense. Because rising action, in my mind, is a little bit misleading because there does have to be a certain pacing to it that isn't just consistent ramping up with no break whatsoever.
I mean,
So
it
to me,
can
it makes
be.
sense.
to a certain extent.
Yeah, depending on what story you're telling. If you're writing like Fast and Furious, just go for it. But I mean, the previous chapter was more of a dragon battle. What do we do? Everybody's in danger. So this is a little bit more lower key in that sense, but also still pushing the whole plot forward because they're actively going on the search now that they've made a plan and decided to follow through on that plan, and before they hadn't fully made a decision yet, or Pana hadn't made their decision until the end of that chapter previously.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely going after the thing now. And definitely, like, I don't know if it's necessarily that things have ramped up. It's like sort of getting there. So this is definitely, it's not Harry, Hermione, and Ron facing down like crazy, dangerous, scary things. But it's certainly like they're getting to where they need to go and they find, I mean, at the end, they do find the structure that they think at least is like housing the weapon or is the weapon. We don't know yet. And I mean, it's crazy, ginormous. It's in a sinkhole that's like 2 miles wide and very deep. So there's certainly like this ramping up kind of at the end. And I think it's interesting too, just like one of the fun things has been trying to kind of like balance and like put in all these like older technologies and things, like all these things from a different world into this one. So just like imagining them like seeing this metal structure and like none of them like they don't use metal that often. I think a lot of like the metal things that they do use, so like Vare has her, does she have a knife or a sword?
A
I'm
knife, I'm pretty
forgetting.
sure.
She has a knife thing, but like, that was probably like scavenged by someone at some point and isn't, wasn't forged like relatively recently. So it's been fun like seeing this ramping up not just of like stakes, but just the connectivity like between the past and like the present in a way too.
I can see that in a storyline sense, but because like literally they're destroying weapons that were created way back when in the past, pre-apocalypse. As for the metal structure that they find at the very end, I didn't know how to interpret it because they literally find it in the chapter end, so I hadn't seen too many instances of them, like the characters themselves interacting with the technology yet, but I do definitely feel the the thread of the plot line is definitely pulling threads from the past a lot more heavily now that the characters are actually aware of what went on a little bit more, or mostly Pana from the visions.
Yeah. I mean, I think at this point it's not so like we haven't seen them react to it, but like I mean just based off of how they've been reacting to like everything else, like I'm remembering Pana I mean, finding Naka like at first and he's just like a single person with his kids and Pana was like, "Whoa, this is like I didn't realize people could even survive outside of the village." And then they find like another village, and then they find like the whole port thing. So, I mean, we'll see them react in the next story, of course, but I think it's like one of those parts where you like cut off a story and you're like you have to kind of step in and just like imagine what they're thinking. And there's definitely like this sense, at least I hope, of like well, we've seen them react to all these other things. Like how are they going to react to like a giant building like this that's made out of like a material that no one knows how to manipulate? So I don't know. I'm just I'm excited to like really start to have all these like crazy things that don't make sense in the worldview of the characters. And they have to kind of like come in and just deal with it and like learn how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. I think it will be very interesting to see. I have not read the next chapter yet, so I will see very soon. But as for rising action, I think it does make sense chronologically, but also the way the story plays out at this point, I feel like as a reader, I finally have enough information to understand the stakes a little bit more. So even though the danger, like in the dragon battle, was much more immediate and it felt very, tense, this chapter, they're not directly in danger really, except for maybe a sinkhole or two falling into it. But it definitely, for me, has much more of a undercurrent of tension because we know this is something that could literally destroy the world, or people tried to use the weapon to destroy the world before. And it's made clear that they don't even know how they might destroy it and that they could be putting their own lives at risk by doing this. So it definitely feels more like, I guess, the choice to risk their own lives is more apparent here than it was necessarily in the previous chapter, where they were kind of thrown into danger because the dragon just showed up. Whereas this, as a reader, I'm going like, okay, they're still walking straight towards the danger. I don't know why. I mean, I know why, but like, you're more apparent because like they have plenty of time to turn around and give up. So I guess it's kind of building tension in a way by making the reader wait for the thing to actually happen.
I mean, and I think the waiting is key. Like as you've been talking, I've been thinking of two cases where there's like waiting and there's like movement. So my first example is also in Harry Potter, in the Half-Blood Prince, like before Dumbledore dies. It's not just like, oh, something happened and then like something else happened. You have like the cave scene, so like they go, they find the fake Horcrux, and then like they literally have to go.
Explain this more. Is this Harry and Dumbledore find the fake Horcrux in the lake with the dead thing, people
Yes,
thing?
the dead
Okay.
scary things that I never keep my eyes open during the movie for.
Uh huh.
Um, but yeah, so they go and they do that. So like they do an important thing, and then they apparate back to Hogsmeade because you can't go to Hogwarts directly. And then you find out that the Dark Mark is like above Hogwarts. There's like a local barkeeper, Madame Rosmerta, who's like, "Oh, it's horrible. Like we don't know what's happening." And then she gives Harry and Dumbledore broomsticks, and they literally have to fly to get there. And there's like something about the language in that scene. Like it's a short scene. They just like fly, but like there's description. Like Harry's looking at Dumbledore, and in hindsight, maybe it was a shock when you first read it, like, oh, Dumbledore dies like soon after. But in hindsight, like when you're looking at that scene, you can really tell like, oh, like Dumbledore is dying, and like this is a scene where he's literally moving into his death in a way, both like physically and just like mentally, like he's getting to this place where his character is about to die. So like there's that. I'm also thinking of a Star Wars episode in Star Wars Rebels, which I mean, Izzy, you haven't seen, but I remember watching so this is season 4 of Rebels, so like spoilers if you don't want to know what happens. But one of the main characters, Kanan, there's literally an episode called Jedi Night, Night, so like night, like the time of day. Before the episode even came out, people were like, "Oh, he's gonna die in this," and then the episode like made it super clear, like, "Oh, he cuts his hair." He has like really touching scenes where he like I don't remember if he like hugs the other characters or he just like tells them they're all great, but there's like specific scenes in there where you're like, okay, this guy is dying, and like this episode is like specifically the episode where like we're gonna spend time and like move him to this place where he's getting to the point where he needs to die in the story. I'm not sure if that's necessarily in my story, but I think like Izzy, your point about there being this tension is what I'm kind of trying to get at. And I mean those stories do it like way better than I do, of course. But I think there is a real fear of like, oh, we've de-escalated things for now. We're taking time, like we're taking a step back. We're like hiking, we're looking for this thing that kind of reads, at least I hope it reads, and I'm trying to make it read like there is a real threat coming up. So like you're not just feeling that the stakes are high like in the middle of a fight with a dragon or whatever, but that there's these moments of like calm and relative peace where you start to get a sense of like, oh, like things are okay now, but we're moving into this place where things could go terribly wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that very much sums up what kind of happens in the chapter. How, I mean, I was thinking of it as a reader being like, okay, step one was the easy step, which was find the thing. Step two is the dangerous step, where they have to maybe destroy, maybe kill themselves by destroying the weapon.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely part of that, like a step process, like, oh, you need to do this thing, and then you need to do this thing. Now I'm kind of just like really thinking about the movement aspect of it. And the fact that you like, in order to get to the climax, like you need to go through the rising action. So, yeah, I'm thinking of it like as a pathway, sort of, if that makes sense. Even back to the Sorcerer's Stone, like our main text that we were talking about before. I mean, there is like, they literally have a scene of Harry and the gang like walking to get to the obstacles in the first place. And then you do have like the obstacles and you have like, oh, A, B, C, D, like whatever, but they're also moving. So like it also at the same time serves as that kind of path. So like you're celebrating with them and you're like, oh, like they just did this, woohoo. You get to the next obstacle, you're like, oh, like they just solved that too. But there's still this undercurrent of like, okay, so they succeeded, things are going okay. And then you get to like the troll and the troll is already knocked out and you're like, and they're literally just like walking by it. And you're like, okay, this kind of like relatively peaceful moment, like, will it last? I don't know. And there's this fear of like, what happens when they get to the end of the tunnel? Like, what is Harry gonna find there? And is it going to be like something he can overcome? So rising action is both like a sequence of things in a way. It can be, obviously you can break these rules too, I'm sure, but it's also a pathway. And I mean, it could be like I'm focusing more on like this aspect of like calm and like removal that serves as this like tension point, but like you can totally make it much more like action packed probably and like, in your face. So there's ways of going about doing it like however you want really.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I mean, I guess my definition of rising action is a little bit looser, where it kind of, to me, implies a mixture of pacing between we're going very fast right now and things are exciting, and then there is a little, calm among the storm, and then things go back to being bad, to kind of further draw readers in the way that I'm used to reading a book and being drawn in. Not, I do not have a specific example to cite, but reading a book and there's a problem and then problem gets solved, but then as that there's going to be something else that happens. Because I do think sometimes as it can be wearing for the problem to just be, unless you're in a book series and you're close to the end of the book series and you're really close to the big finale, to have an onslaught of nonstop things are bad and like tension just keeps rising and there's no pauses in between. I think depends on the circumstances of what story you're telling. But I like the mix and match, or for the pacing. And I think also generally it's just more common to find in narratives. But also I do love, the non-chronological narratives are really interesting to see too, because then you have to figure out which piece of this is the rising action versus which piece of this already happened. I'm thinking about like the first season of The Witcher, where they tell the story non-chronologically on purpose, just in the TV show, because I have not read the books, but the books are all chronologically told. So this was a choice that they just specifically made for the Netflix show. But I think that non-chronologicalness does add tension in itself, because you know this person has already died, but they're alive in this scene because it's earlier, and so having foreknowledge kind of what will happen can also create tension if you wanted to break from telling something chronologically.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways to do whatever you want with the rising action to make it like as interesting as you want. So obviously, like do what's best for your story. Don't just like take our word for like what we're looking for in a rising action. I thought it would be fun though, potentially,
Mm-hmm.
if since we're talking about rising action, are there any things that are like set up right now that have like led you to expect anything coming up? Do you have any like theories of things that might happen? I'm curious more, not based off of things I've told you, but if there's anything like in the text, I'm really curious to see where you think the story is potentially going from here. Beyond like the obvious, oh, like they find the weapon and they're gonna try to do something about it.
Okay. It's hard because I have information that you told me that I can't bring into a theory. It's not in the text.
I don't think you have too much information. I
Well,
know you have like the Catra scene, but I don't know how much like I told you about the context of that.
I don't know pretty much anything about that context. But from the chapter itself, logically speaking, as a reader, I have to be suspicious that Vare has actually left the boat with everyone else, even though we don't get any kind of blatant hints that Vare is still on the boat somewhere, but it seems too convenient for her to have just given up and left. So probably she's following them, and I'm not sure how she would be able to make it to the weapon, because they find the weapon with Wave Skimmer flying them to it, and she cannot fly. But I'm sure she'll find a way to it, and they'll maybe get into a fight, or maybe just have some sort of tense conversation. But at this point, I'm tempted to say that Vare is in a less, kill on sight mood after Pana saved everyone from the dragon with Wave Skimmer. But I also feel like maybe the dragon incident could have shaken her up, so she would not be in the best mental state, potentially, as well.
Did the flashback scene like impact what you think might happen? And I'd also just want to point out, because like yes, as we've said, like Vare's not in this in like the present moment, and I think for me, like because I wanted to include Vare in this, obviously, it was less interesting to be like she got off the boat and she's like following them. So I thought it would be more interesting to go back to like the first day where everyone's getting ready to kind of like follow Pana out of the village. So it kind of serves like the same idea, sort of like, oh, in both cases, like Vari's leaving and like going after Pana. But I wanted like a little bit more backstory about like what happened that day. And we get to see Pana's father again, which is always good. So yeah, I'm just curious, like how did that impact like what you know or think about Vare and like where she is and like what's gonna happen.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it just made me think she's definitely still going to be doing what she can to keep on Pana's trail and keep following them. But, I mean, she was talking to Pana's father, so she wouldn't, she doesn't seem like the kind of character who would say terrible things to Pana's father's face. So maybe she was thinking things that I don't know of, but she seemed much more sympathetic and understanding, and less of the extreme version that we've seen of her before, being like, dead or alive, bring Pana back. So she wasn't quite in that mindset, at least when she was leaving the village. Maybe it's because I'm an optimist, but I was like, maybe this is a sign that she's coming back to that original mindset when she originally left the village of like, just trying to, you know, get Pana back, but she herself wasn't carrying one of the sharpened icicles, I don't think. So she hadn't, like, the intention to harm Pana at the point when she was leaving the village. So the optimistic part of me wants to say she's going back full circle to, you know, wanting to carry out some sort of accountability process or closure of some kind for the harm that Pana indirectly caused through all the dragon murders. But I'm also not sure. I know my optimistic side is very unrealistic, and she probably hasn't gone back to that as a character. Or as real people, they don't usually do that.
I don't know, maybe. we'll we'll see.
But she wasn't really that present in the chapter previously, other than a brief scene or two. So it's hard to say what mind state she's in.
Yeah, she's been kind of absent since like story 5 for the most part.
Yeah. So the best I can theorize, I'm not very good at theorizing things, but the best I can theorize is that she is definitely still following Pana. They're going to have a confrontation, and it may or may not involve violence. Pana's still probably going to do the let's just talk about it move, and then Vare will, depending on what state of mind she's in, which I'm not sure of, will either be like, maybe I can talk, or heck no, now's not the time. The time for talk is gone.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm glad that I got it to a point where like it can go either way. I think that's very exciting.
Well, it could just be that I'm too much of an optimist. Maybe she does seem more vengeful than I'm hoping she is.
I don't know. I mean, and you also know, because I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before too, like I also try to be more optimistic with my stories, and like I absolutely prefer stories with happy endings. And I'm thinking back to the director of the Star Wars Rebels TV show, just to go back to that, in the finale, like almost no one died. I think there was like one clone who died. And the director was like, all the fans were upset, and the director's like, you guys like want these people to die? Like I thought you were rooting for them. He's like, I like happy stories where the heroes win. And I kind of just relate to that a lot. So like yes, this story is dark in many respects. I definitely am more of an optimistic writer. I want to see more happy endings. Ideally, I don't know how well I achieve that, but yeah, I don't know. So I don't know if it's you being optimistic or if it's me writing in a more optimistic way, but I think it's great that we can at least like question that, and like you're not sure if it's like if you're just too optimistic or not. Yeah. No, I think I'm happy with that response and the potential for there to be some mystery as to what's gonna happen.
Okay, I'm glad I'm not reading too deeply into things, just because I want the goodness in all characters to eventually come out. I hold out hope for characters so much.
I mean, it's fun to do. Like, I mean, Zuko, like, it's so much fun to like go back and like root for him and be like, you can be good now. And then he like shoots a fireball at Aang, and you're like, oh no, I'm so disappointed in you. um,
Yeah. No, there's actually, now that as soon as I said it, I was like, there's certain characters that I never root for. As soon as they show that they're douchebags, I'm like, never mind. You might as well be dead to me. But there are other characters that are more, I see their potential. Like,
mhm.
Palpatine is never one that I rooted for his inner goodness to win out. Like, he was not written to have inner goodness that could ever win out.
No,
But like
he's
Anakin,
pure evil in comedy.
Anakin is like a character. I know I have a soft spot for the prequels because they were the ones I saw at a slate. I saw the original series younger, and then I saw the prequel series still young, but like slightly less young, so I remember them better. So I did root for Anakin to like not become evil. I was also young enough to not realize how bad, like, murdering an entire village is in the second movie. So sometimes
Yeah.
the implications of all of his actions didn't fully hit when I was a kid. But
I mean, also, it's not, our world. So, like, I mean, there's a whole conversation about Darth Vader and, like, his redemption. Like, oh, is he really a good guy now? Or are we just going to ignore, like, Alderaan and everything else? And it's like, well, it's Star Wars. It's not real. So, like, yeah, you can, like, forgive him, I guess, in this one, like, fantasy case. But even with Darth Vader, like he's done horrible things, and you're like, I'm rooting for you to come back, like rejoin the light. Like the climax at the end of Return of the Jedi. It's not like we're not rooting for Luke to kill Darth Vader. We're rooting for him to bring his father back to the light side. So there's definitely something to be said about like wanting characters and connecting with this idea of like wanting characters to come back to the light and like be good.
yeah, definitely. I mean, to have another Shira example, Katra definitely always has that feeling for me where I root for her so hard, and she proves me wrong so many times. But eventually, she gets there.
She was rough to watch. And she also does like some terrible things. Like I feel like almost none of these characters in the real world, like we just be like, okay, like come back now, like everything's good. Except for
No, none
maybe
of these
Zuko, because he really doesn't do anything that like he fights a lot, but he doesn't kill like anyone.
that we know of on screen.
Oh, true.
I mean, he's been searching for Aang for like 2 years before Aang actually shows up. Who knows what happened in those 2 years?
I don't know. I think he played a lot of Pai Sho, but that's okay. We're getting into a tangent though. Um,
But that makes me think of another thing. For rising action, it's not just, the literal events that are happening, but also, of course, how you have developed your characters so that sometimes their character's journey, like inner journey or emotional journey or however you want to phrase it, becomes a lot like just as important or maybe even more important depending on what kind of story you're writing than the plot narrative, depending on how character driven you want your story to be or not be. Like, sometimes it can be really integral to the plot. For She-Ra, Katra's coming to the light part was integral to the final season working out, and the plot would not have functioned if her character hadn't been written to be at the point where she could finally turn a new leaf over and actually become a better version of herself, finally. So, I would say for your story, I don't know enough about Vari. She's probably not at the new leaf phase yet. She definitely is not. But there is still the emotional tension because I don't feel convinced she's in the murderous rage that she used to be in earlier chapters. So I think the rising action also is not just the building up of tension, but the building up of, more uncertainty.
no, I think that's a really good point, especially just your conversation about like emotional character development too. Yeah, I mean, and we'll see what happens. I think there's definitely an element of this of like these two characters, and it's not just the plot of them like getting to this place. It's their state of mind at this point too, and like how this hike impacts their no, the hike doesn't impact their state of mind that much, but
It
what
could.
they're
Nature.
it could the serenity of nature. They're all coming down now. But basically where they're at like on this hike. So it's not just them like moving through a forest getting to this place. It's their literal like movement as character, not literal movement, figurative movement as characters. um, getting from where they were, Vare potentially being more of a, violent, seeking justice kind of person to wherever she's going to end up when she gets to the end of this nice woodsy forest path, and Pana, moving from this place of like them being super just not confident with themselves to kind of figuring out what they're doing and like what their purpose is. That's it.
Thinking of another example of rising action that led into a climax that was disappointing. I just didn't think the rising action was developed really well, in my opinion, but then the climax that it led to, for me, did not make sense for the character's development up to that point, because the character. It was explained that she was sort of possessed and that her actions were not her own. But I was still like, no, this character just wouldn't do this. Not this easily, at least.
What story is this?
I don't remember the author, but its name is Malice. It's fantasy. Oh, it is Heather Walter Malice. Basically, a retelling of like the Sleeping Beauty story, loosely, with the royal family has a sleeping curse.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that. Or no. It's not a sleeping curse. It's worse than that. It's a death curse. If the female members of the royal family don't find and kiss like their true love before they turn 21, they'll drop dead.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Oh no.
But the main character is Alice, and Malice is the name because everybody hates her for fantasy racism reasons. She's like half
Hmm.
human and half not human.
Uh,
And they're like, how terrible, you're from the evil people who like we tried to kill off, and the big fantasy war, they were the evil ones in the war. But at the end of the book, she like is really, she and the princess are like best buds to lovers, and then at the end of the book it looks like things are not going to work out, and that, oh, and there is the Sleeping Beauty. It is Alice has magic and is able to change the curse from being a death curse to being a sleeping curse, and puts the princess to sleep so she doesn't die.
hmm.
But no, I'm telling that wrong. She saved the princess, wasn't going to die anyway because they had true love's kiss, and she was like, the curse is broken. But then because of other dumb reasons, she had to put the princess to sleep instead. And then things just kind of went haywire. But up to that point, there was a good amount of tension rising, and sort of a mixture of finding stability in relationships, and them, the princess and Alice, being like, wow, the princess's name is Aurora, of course, because like Aurora, Sleeping Beauty. But a mixture of, them finally like getting together and like finding stability versus Alice is betrayed by another character. Massive spoilers for anybody reading this, or who might read this. So, Alice is betrayed by another character, and it's like, oh no, what happened here? Why? But then the betrayal ends up going in a completely different direction from what I thought it was going to go in, and Alice ends up being sort of possessed, and I feel like that's where it went haywire, is when she started acting from being possessed by this ancient evil being. It kind of threw me. It was a little jarring. Up until that point, the rising action had been going very smoothly, and then that was like the switch over into the climax, I suppose, where she just kind of went and destroyed everything and was like, screw this, society is messed up and I'm gonna destroy it. And it's like valid, but also it didn't seem like it was fitting with the lines of character development up until that point, at least as far as I was reading it.
I mean, I guess that's the concern about getting to that climax of the story. So like the rising action doesn't just like build up to something, but like in order for it to be satisfying, like there needs to be some, the climax needs to ensure that the rising action is satisfying in some way. So like everything, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same story. So it all kind of needs to fit together, however that might be, and they all impact, like each part of the story impacts your understanding and enjoyment of like the rest of the story.
Yes, exactly so. I'm just thinking I have still probably will not see Game of Thrones, but whatever they did with the finale was not it.
I mean, that's like I can talk more about Star Wars because like I haven't seen Game of Thrones, and so we just recorded an episode with Andy. Well, I did, and we were talking about our enjoyment of specifically The Force Awakens, so episode 7. And like I kind of have grown to enjoy it more over time, whereas like I initially disliked it, and then like The Last Jedi made me really enjoy it a lot more. Whereas
Episode
Andy,
7
yeah,
is the first in the new trilogy, so what's it called?
The Force Awakens.
Did you already say that?
Yes,
Oh,
I'll
you
probably
can
cut that
edit
out.
this out.
So whereas Andy originally really liked The Force Awakens, and then he got to the point where he saw The Rise of Skywalker, and the way that impacted and built on slash didn't really build on some of the storylines in Force Awakens has subsequently like made it a little bit less enjoyable for him. So definitely like there's this way in which parts of a story, even if it's within like the same story itself, like how you were talking about it, it can impact your enjoyment of like the entirety of the book. It's like you might be reading something and like you're really enjoying it, and then you get to a point and you're like, well, now everything like kind of stinks, and it colors like how you view the rest of the story as well. So that's definitely we'll see what happens with my finale coming up, but hopefully everything seems to kind of make sense and be okay. We'll see.
Well, I look forward to reading it, and I'll let you know my thoughts. And readers, you'll also, of course, hear those thoughts in our next episode.
Gonna be fun. You have like 35 pages to read. It's the longest story I've written.
Oh no. Okay.
Just so you know, you can prepare for that.
I'll block off time. I'm a very slow reader.
It had to be. It's a finale, so it's long. The rising action is short. So I don't know if that's actually like a thing that happens like all the time. That's just what it feels like in a lot of cases, though.
Depending on the story you're trying to tell, different amounts of rising action work. I feel like The Shining is almost entirely rising action. And for me, it's too much. It's maddening. And I'm like, I can cut out all of this. None of this tricycling around the hotel is important to me. Too much rising
Hmm,
action. But it's a balance that is different for every story.
indeed. So now we're gonna move on and talk about a favorite line that stood out to us and just a little bit about why and what we thought was interesting about it. Izzy, do you have a favorite line?
Yes, I just chose this because I wanted to show off that I know how to read a contour map. Um, it's just a description of a character looking at the map, and I was like, I know exactly what they're talking about. But the lines are MC pointed at one of the few locations that was free of markings. A few rings surrounded it, but not much else. There. It isn't very large, but that is a plateau. The rings show different elevations, see? It rises really steeply, and then it stops. The top is super flat. So I just appreciated that I knew exactly how they were describing cliffs, even though the map doesn't say cliffs or anything, but for a contour map, the closer together the the rings that are on a map, the steeper the elevation is, because each ring marks an elevation change. So more rings is very quick change.
Indeed. Well done. Like a true cartographer. Yeah, I don't know if I like. it definitely probably could have been described better, and like I might go back and like make some edits just to the language there. It's fun putting in some, you know, some maps. Maps are good.
No, I think it's very interesting. We could have a whole separate conversation of the role of maps in this book.
We could. So my favorite line, or not, I mean favorite, but just the line that stood out to me. So we're in the flashback scene with Vare, and she goes to Pana's house, and like the house is like they're all made out of ice, so it's like kind of difficult to get like straight edges on any of the buildings. But Pana's house is like really just like curvy and like weird. And there was this one line that I really liked. Even the chimney ended 5 feet to the left of where it began. So it's just a wacky chimney. And I like this idea, like not that the chimney like has any idea of the growth and progression of the characters in the story, but this idea of like something starting and then like you don't know where it's gonna end up and like things happen in the construction of said chimneys and you know people like Vare is we don't know where she's gonna end up. Something might happen. She, started down this path with a specific goal in mind, and we'll see if she accomplishes said goal or decides upon something else. And like Pana started off in a different place too, and they've grown a lot over the course of this story. So it was just fun. Happy moment where chimneys reflect characters and plot progression.
Yeah, no, I forgot about that description of the house, but I like very much the idea of a curvy chimney. I like quirky little houses like that. It sounds very nice. Although a house made of ice doesn't sound like the most comfortable to live in per se, but very interesting.
Oh, I love a good igloo. They're fun. So, Izzy, do you have any last minute final thoughts? Not last minute. Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking rising action after all of our conversation. It means literally for me events are taking place that are not just exposition telling you what the story is, what is happening, or sending their character off on the journey, but these are everything, all the information has been laid out, so these are events that are specifically built into the story to amp up and bring whatever the action is or whatever the character's inner journey is to the next level to prepare them for the climax. So I'm thinking of it more of a this is the point in the story where you should be thinking, is what I'm writing reflective of my character's inner journey, if that's something your story wants to focus on, or does my character's inner journey line up with how the action is ramping up, depending on how much you want to relate those two. And is the action ramping up, and have I set up my readers with enough information so that they will feel tension is occurring, or so that they'll feel informed so that they can be invested in what is happening. Even if you do the non-chronological mix-up where somebody is dead, or the thing exploded already, but now the characters actually care, or no, now the characters actually have gone through more of their journey non-chronologically, and readers or viewers understand what the actual stakes are for what is happening. So I guess taking a check to say, have I, met the benchmarks to set this up so a reader could, who is not me, who knows my story, but so a reader could understand and feel, this makes sense. I understand why they feel upset, or I understand why the story is making sense. Of course, comprehensibility is kind of step one of, I did this well. The writing makes sense. But also I think the idea of pacing it, which varies drastically depending on what kind of story you're telling and your medium and whatnot. But I think don't be afraid to take a pause, or don't be afraid to give your characters a little contemplative moment and, leave your reader or your viewer kind of stewing a little bit. I think it can be good sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I also think the thing that I'm coming away with is like, it's also important like what don't you write in your rising action too. So what are you allowing or like hoping that your reader is going to kind of interpret and read into the story? Kind of in the same way where like, Dumbledore flying on the broom and like everything that happens with the Jedi in Star Wars Rebels, like it's not stated like, oh, these people are going to die, but those scenes to me like feel very much as if that's what we should be expecting as readers. And there's a certain element of like, I'm not, I didn't write in here like, oh, we're all like going to be facing this crazy thing and like, we all might die like very shortly, the characters. But I'm hoping that there's, this tension that we were talking about and that readers can kind of like imagine for themselves like, oh, this is a really stressful, like potentially dangerous situation that they're about to be in. A lot of this is like what you put into it and how clear you make it. But I'm also just curious about the ways in which we write about things while not necessarily like addressing them. So how do we craft a scene in which the thing that's happening or the thing that's going to happen is like clearly present in it but isn't addressed like explicitly? I don't know. And like maybe that's not, my interpretation of those scenes that I'm talking about can be very different from like other people's. So again, just like trying to imagine what the reader is bringing into it, I think is a really interesting thought process.
Yeah, definitely. I would say keeping it, trying to your best to keep in mind reader expectations and reader assumptions as best you can is really crucial for the rising action and for the climax part of the story.
But with that being said, I think we're going to sign off now. So thank you all for listening to another episode of Determination, Deliberation, and Dragons. If you enjoy what you are listening to, feel free to check us out on our Patreon. The link will be in the description down below. And that's about it. Thank you all for listening and have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, night, time period of your choice.
Have a wonderful 19th century, everyone. Yeah, the
Sure.
19th century was surely pretty horrible in many different ways, but you know,
And isn't able to be enjoyed now, but enjoy it anyway.
read a nice period piece. I had a thought, but I forgot it. I got distracted.